The door to the Gable Mercantile closed, with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut. It was a solid, final sound, made of heavy oak and oiled iron, and it cut Ilara off from the only life she had ever known. On the other side of that door was the warmth of the pot-bellied stove, the scent of dried apples and cured tobacco, and the stern, unforgiving faces of her husband's parents. In her hand were 3 silver dollars and a folded deed, the paper as brittle and cold as their hearts. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 6 months, taken by a fever that burned through the town of Providence like a prairie fire. Now, with the first chill of autumn in the air, and Thomas's child growing within her, she was being cast out. Mr. Gable had not shouted. His cruelty was a quieter, more precise instrument. He had stood behind his counter, his hands flat on the polished wood, and laid out the terms of her exile. The store, the small house behind it, the life Thomas had built, it was all theirs. They had no legal or moral obligation to a woman who was not their blood, carrying a child they claimed might not even be their son's. The whispers had started a month after the funeral, insidious and ugly, and the Gables had nurtured them like a prized crop. She was a burden, a mouth to feed through the winter, with no man to earn her keep. Her inheritance, Mr. Gable had explained with a thin, dry smile, was the single piece of property Thomas had owned outright before their marriage. A worthless tract of land 5 miles north of town, a place the locals called Gable's Folly. It was a jagged cut in the side of the Stone Tooth Ridge, a place of scree, stunted pines, and a shallow cave that was more of a scar in the rock than a habitable space. Thomas had bought it in a fit of youthful optimism, believing he might one day find a silver vein. He had found nothing but rock and disappointment. The deed was a joke, a piece of paper that represented nothing of value. It was their final, calculated insult. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, the dust of the main street swirling around her ankles. Her entire world was contained in a small canvas sack on her back, a spare dress, a wool blanket, a small knife, and a tinderbox. The 3 silver dollars felt heavy in her palm, a weight of both insult and necessity. Across the street, faces watched from windows, curtains twitching. They were the faces of people she had known her whole life, people who had attended her wedding and mourned at her husband's funeral. Now they were silent witnesses, their pity as useless as the deed she clutched. They saw a doomed woman, a widow with no prospects, set out to face the wilderness with winter breathing down her neck. They saw a tragedy unfolding, and they turned away. Ilara did not cry. The shock was too deep, the injustice too cold. It felt less like a wound and more like an amputation. A part of her life had been severed, cleanly and without anesthetic. She looked down at the 3 coins. One would buy a ticket on the morning stagecoach, east to some unknown city where she would be just another desperate face. The other 2 would barely last a week. But then she looked north, toward the dark, serrated line of the Stone Tooth Ridge against the graying sky. The town saw a tomb. Her in-laws saw an ending. But it was hers. The deed in her hand, meant as a final mockery, was the only thing on earth that belonged to her. She made a choice, not with hope, but with a grim, bone-deep refusal to be erased. She walked past the stagecoach office, her boots making a quiet, determined sound on the planks. She walked into the blacksmith shop, the smell of hot iron and coal smoke, a welcome, honest scent after the cloying sweetness of the mercantile. She laid 1 silver dollar on the anvil. "I need a good axe," she said, her voice steady. The blacksmith, a man named Peters with arms like tree trunks, looked at the coin, then at her face. He saw the resolve there, the absence of tears, and he gave her a knowing, somber nod. He handed her a sturdy felling axe with a well-seated hickory handle, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. It was worth twice what she paid. With her last $2, she bought a small sack of flour, a block of salt, and a single, thick wool shirt from a different store, refusing to give the Gables another cent of her paltry inheritance. Then, without a backward glance at the town of Providence, she turned her face to the north and began to walk. The canvas sack was heavier now, the axe a comforting weight in her hand. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. It was the wind of a coming winter, and it was blowing her toward the only home she had left. The journey was a punishment. The 5 miles stretched into an eternity of uneven ground and biting wind. The trail dwindled from a wagon-rutted track into a faint deer path, then vanished altogether into a landscape of broken rock and thorny brush. Each step was an effort, the weight of her meager supplies and the growing child inside her a constant, dragging burden. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, offering no warmth, only a bleak light that illuminated the desolation around her. The Stone Tooth Ridge loomed larger, a wall of gray granite that seemed to suck the very color from the air. She arrived as dusk was turning the world to shades of charcoal and ink. Gables Folly was worse than the stories. It was a gash in the hillside, a chaotic spill of fractured rock and scree that led up to a dark, frowning opening in the cliff face. The cave was a shallow wound, no deeper than a large wagon, its floor a mess of sharp stones and damp earth. A few skeletal pines clung to the rock, their branches twisted into shapes of agony by the relentless wind. The air was cold, sharp, and smelled of wet rock and decay. This was not a place to live, it was a place to die. For the first time since the mercantile door had closed, despair washed over her. It was a physical force, buckling her knees and stealing the air from her lungs. The town was right. The Gables were right. This was a cruel joke, a sentence of slow death by exposure. She sank onto a cold, flat rock, the axe slipping from her numb fingers. The wind howled through the rocks, a mournful, hungry sound. Stinging tears finally blurred her vision, freezing on her cheeks. She was utterly alone, with nothing but a worthless piece of rock and a winter that promised to be brutal. She pressed a hand to her belly, a protective, desperate gesture. It was not just her life at stake. She sat there for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into her bones, a deep, numbing chill that mirrored the emptiness inside her. But as she huddled deeper into her blanket, seeking some small pocket of shelter from the wind, she noticed something. The wind was screaming past the mouth of the cave, but inside, the air was still. She crawled forward, past the curtain of wind at the entrance, and into the shallow darkness. The air inside was not just still, it was different. It was warmer. Not warm, but distinctly less cold than the air outside. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference, but it was there. Her curiosity, a flicker of life in the frozen landscape of her despair, was piqued. She pushed herself up and moved deeper into the cave, her hands tracing the rough, damp stone of the back wall. The rock itself felt less cold. She pressed her cheek against it. It was cool, but it lacked the biting, soul-stealing chill of the rocks outside. And then she saw it. A tiny wisp of vapor, like a ghost of breath on a winter morning, rising from a thin crack in the floor at the very back of the cave. She knelt, her frozen fingers tracing the fissure. A faint, steady warmth radiated from it, a gentle, persistent heat that felt like life itself. She followed the crack with her eyes as it snaked up the back wall, a dark line ascending into the shadows above. Far overhead, she could just make out a sliver of gray sky through another opening, a natural chimney leading up through the mountain. She held her hand over the fissure in the floor again. It was a geothermal spring, buried deep within the mountain, its heat bleeding up through the rock. The cave wasn't just a shelter from the wind. It was sitting on a natural furnace. The worthless, barren hole in the rock had a secret. It had a hidden, beating heart of warmth. In that moment, the tears stopped. The despair receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt as real and solid as the stone beneath her knees. The town was wrong. This was not a tomb. It was a chance. The first days were a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Ilara's world shrank to the cave, the axe, and the screaming protest of muscles she never knew she had. Her hands, soft from a life in town, were quickly rubbed raw, then blistered, then broken open. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips torn from her spare dress and continuing her work. The first task was to make the space livable. She cleared the sharp stones from the cave floor, stacking them outside in a growing pile. She used the flat of her axe to scrape the damp earth level, creating a space to lay her blanket near the warm fissure at the back. That fissure became the center of her universe. At night, she would curl up on the stone floor directly above it, the gentle, constant heat seeping into her exhausted body, keeping the worst of the night's chill at bay. Her first great project was a wall. The cave offered a roof and 2.5 walls, but the wide, open front was an invitation to the wind and whatever predators roamed the ridge. Using fallen logs from the stunted pine forest and the stones she had cleared from the floor, she began to build. The logs were heavy, awkward things. She learned to use leverage, rolling them on smaller branches, her body straining with every inch of progress. The stones were a different kind of challenge. She chose the flattest ones, hauling them one by one, her back and legs burning with the effort. She had no mortar yet, so she stacked them carefully, interlocking them like pieces of a crude puzzle, creating a low wall that would at least break the force of the wind. Every stone laid was a small victory against the wilderness. She discovered a second gift of the land. A short walk from the cave, she found a deposit of thick, gray clay, kept moist by a slow seep of water from the hillside. It was heavy and dense, perfect for mortar. She spent 2 days digging it out with her knife and bare hands, carrying it back in makeshift slings made from her blanket. She mixed the clay with water and dried grasses, creating a thick, sticky daub. With this, she began to fill the gaps in her stone wall, sealing it against the wind. The work was slow and messy, but as the wall grew higher, so did her sense of security. She left a narrow opening for a door and a smaller square for a window, which she could cover with her blanket at night. Next, she turned her attention to heat and water. The geothermal warmth was a blessing, but it wasn't enough to cook or to fight off the deep cold that was coming. She needed a real fire. The fissure that vented the steam ran up the back wall, a perfect natural chimney. Against this wall, she built a hearth, a semicircle of the flattest, most solid stones she could find. She packed the outside with her clay mortar, creating a solid, heat-retaining structure. For weeks, her days were a rhythm of chopping wood and building. She felled dead pines, her axe strokes growing more confident and efficient. She hauled the wood back, stacking it inside the cave until a formidable wall of fuel lined one side. The day she lit the first fire in her new hearth was a momentous occasion. The smoke, instead of filling the cave, was drawn cleanly up the fissure in the rock, disappearing into the mountain. The fire caught, and a wave of radiant heat pushed back the damp chill. She sat before it, her raw hands held out to the warmth, and felt a profound, quiet pride. She had built a home. The water that seeped near the clay deposit was clean and cold. She dug a channel, lining it with flat stones, guiding a trickle of the water closer to her cave. Inside, she dug a shallow basin in the floor and spent a week painstakingly lining it with a thick layer of clay, smoothing it with her hands until it was a watertight cistern. The trickle of water filled it slowly, providing a precious, clean supply right inside her shelter. She had shelter, warmth, and water. Now, she needed food. With her systems taking shape, she knew she had to return to Providence. It was a journey she dreaded, but it was necessary. She needed supplies she could not fashion from the wilderness: seeds, chickens for eggs, and more salt to preserve anything she might hunt or trap. She walked back to town, the axe in her hand, her face smudged with dirt and her clothes torn. She was a different woman from the one who had left weeks before. Her hands were calloused, her body leaner and harder. She walked directly into the Gable Mercantile. The handful of customers fell silent, staring. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, and a flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps annoyance, crossed his face before settling back into its usual mask of stern disapproval. He looked at her ragged appearance, a small, smug smile touching his lips. He clearly expected her to be begging. "I need a sack of seed potatoes, some turnip seeds, and a crate of laying hens," she said, her voice clear and strong. She placed the silver axe head on the counter. "And a new handle. I'll trade you for this. It's good steel." A murmur went through the store. The request was absurd. A woman living in a cave on Gable's Folly had no need for laying hens or seeds. Where would she keep them? Where would she plant them? Mr. Gable looked at the axe, then back at her. The mockery was plain in his eyes. "Getting ambitious, are we, Alara? Planning on farming the rocks?" "The chickens will need a sturdy crate," she said, ignoring his jibe. "And I'll need 20 pounds of salt." The transaction was a silent battle of wills. He knew the axe was worth far more than the goods she requested, but the chance to fuel the town's gossip was too good to pass up. He made the trade, his movements slow and deliberate, as if humoring a madwoman. As she prepared to leave, lifting the heavy crate of clucking, confused chickens, he leaned forward. "Winter on the Stone Tooth is no joke," he said, his voice low and condescending. "Pride is a cold blanket, girl. The church has a charity cot for a reason." She met his gaze without flinching. "I will be fine," she said. Then she turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence behind her. The walk back was even harder than the first, wrestling a heavy, awkward crate of chickens up the rocky trail. But with every step, she felt a growing sense of triumph. She had faced him on his own ground and had not broken. It was on that walk back, halfway to the ridge, that she found him. A scruffy, half-starved dog with ribs showing and one torn ear, trailing her at a distance. He was wary, but hunger overcame his fear. She stopped and tossed him a small piece of the hard bread she carried. He snatched it and retreated. She continued, and he followed. By the time she reached her cave, he was sitting 20 yards away, watching her with intelligent, cautious eyes. That night, as she ate her meager meal by the fire, she left a portion for him by the entrance. In the morning, it was gone. She named him Bran. Within a week, he was sleeping just inside the stone wall, a loyal, silent guardian. Her solitary world now had 2 heartbeats instead of 1. Inside the cave, she built a small, warm coop for the chickens against the geothermally heated back wall, using saplings and woven brush. They settled in quickly, their soft clucking a comforting, domestic sound in the stone shelter. For her garden, she hauled endless loads of the dark, rich soil from a pocket of land she'd found below the ridge, carrying it back in her blanket. She created raised beds inside the cave, near the front where some dim light could reach, but deep enough to benefit from the stable temperature and the warmth of the earth. She planted the potatoes and turnips, hardy root vegetables that could thrive in the low light. She had created a complete, interconnected system. The mountain provided warmth and a chimney. The spring provided water. The forest provided wood. And now, the cave itself would provide food. It was a self-contained world, a fortress of life carved into the dead rock. Her last project before the snows came was born from the clay. She found that when fired, the gray clay from the seep turned a deep, stony red and became as hard as rock. Using a simple, makeshift kiln she built with stones and fed with dry pine, she began to make bricks. Her first attempts were cracked and uneven, but she learned quickly. She built molds from scrap wood and perfected the firing time. Soon, she had a neat stack of hard, uniform bricks. They were her currency. They were proof that this worthless land could create value from nothing. They were the foundation of a future she was building with her own 2 hands. The town of Providence settled on a name for her: the Cave Woman of Gable's Folly. The story of her buying chickens and seeds became a favorite piece of gossip, told with headshakes and knowing smiles in the mercantile and the saloon. She was a cautionary tale, a symbol of foolish pride. Brant, a trapper who worked the high country, was the first to bring back a direct report. He'd seen her from a distance, a small figure hauling logs, a wisp of smoke rising impossibly from the rock face. "She's built a wall," he'd scoffed over a drink. "A wall of pebbles against a blizzard. The wolves will have her before the first deep snow." The consensus was clear. She was mad, and her story would end in tragedy. Mr. Gable would nod sagely when he heard these reports, his expression one of feigned sorrow that barely concealed his satisfaction. He had been proven right. Elara was aware of the mockery, though she did not hear it directly. She felt it in the empty wilderness around her, in the profound silence that separated her from the world of men. But the scorn of the town was a distant noise, muffled by the stone walls of the world she had made. Her life fell into a deep, powerful rhythm, dictated by the needs of her small ecosystem. Each day began before dawn. She would rise from her bed of pine boughs and blankets, the air in the cave cool but never truly cold, and tend the fire, adding logs to the glowing embers. The soft clucking of the chickens would greet her as she gave them grain and fresh water from her cistern. Bran would stretch, his tail thumping a quiet greeting on the stone floor, before they went out into the biting morning air. Her days were a cycle of labor and maintenance. She checked her small snares for rabbits, chopped wood, and worked on her brick-making. She tended her strange, subterranean garden, marveling at the pale green shoots that pushed up from the dark soil. The miracle of life in that dim, warm space never ceased to fill her with a quiet awe. She would talk to her plants, to the chickens, to Bran. Her own voice, she realized, was something she rarely used for anyone else. Her world had shrunk to the size of her shelter, but within its walls, she was not a pitiable widow. She was a creator, a provider, a sovereign. Winter arrived not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a physical assault. The wind became a constant, screaming force that threw ice and snow against her wall like handfuls of gravel. The world outside her shelter disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. But inside, her systems held. The stone and clay wall, now reinforced with her own hard-fired bricks, barely trembled. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn up the mountain's natural chimney, leaving no trace for any outside observer but a faint heat haze. The geothermal warmth from the floor kept the temperature in the cave stable and mild. The chickens were safe and warm in their coop, and they continued to lay eggs, precious globes of protein in the frozen world. Her root vegetables grew slowly but steadily in their beds. Before the great storm, there were smaller tests. A pack of wolves, lean and hungry, were drawn by the scent of the chickens. They circled her shelter for 2 nights, their howls weaving into the song of the wind. Bran stood guard at the doorway, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, his presence a living barrier. The stone walls held them back. They could not find a way in, and eventually they moved on. Another time, a minor avalanche of snow and rock slid down the cliff face, burying her entrance. It took her an entire day of relentless digging with a makeshift shovel to clear a path, her muscles screaming in protest. But she did it. Each test she survived hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in what she had built. She was not just surviving, she was enduring. She was proving the world wrong, one solitary day at a time. The blizzard that would be known for a generation as the Great Freeze of '83 did not arrive like a normal storm. It descended like a judgment. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural speed, dropping far below zero and staying there. The air itself seemed to crystallize, sharp and brittle, in the lungs. The wind was a physical blade that stripped heat from any exposed surface, and the snow it carried was not soft powder, but a hard, scouring dust of ice. It was a storm that broke things: ancient trees, the wills of strong men, the very fabric of a community built on the assumption that things could only get so bad. In Providence, the breaking began on the second day. The town's conventional structures, built of wood and confidence, started to fail. The merciless cold found every crack, every poorly chinked log, every warped window frame. Families huddled around their iron stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat was sucked away as fast as it was generated. The walls bled cold. Frost formed on the inside of windows, then on the walls themselves. Livestock, caught in their barns, began to die, their water troughs frozen solid, their bodies stiffening in the stalls. The town's confidence, its bedrock of practical frontier wisdom, shattered like frozen glass. Roofs, built to handle snow, could not handle the sheer, dead weight of the ice that followed, and they began to groan and splinter. The steeple of the church cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The large windows of the gable mercantile, a symbol of prosperity, were webbed with fractures from the contracting wood frames. Firewood, stockpiled for a normal winter, was being consumed at a terrifying rate. The communal woodpile was dwindling to nothing. Fear, colder than any wind, began to creep through the town. People stopped visiting neighbors, hoarding their warmth, their world shrinking to a single, freezing room. Providence was a collection of isolated, desperate islands of cold. But 5 miles north, inside the Stone Tooth Ridge, Elara's world remained whole. The storm was a distant, roaring fury, a monster scratching at a door it could not open. Her brick and stone wall stood silent and impassive against the onslaught. Inside, a profound and steady calm reigned. The geothermal heat from the floor provided a constant baseline warmth that kept the deepest chill at bay, meaning her fire did not have to rage, it only had to burn steadily. Her firewood stockpile, which had seemed immense, was now a source of deep security. Her animals were calm. The chickens pecked at their feed in their warm corner, and Bran slept peacefully by the hearth, untroubled by the war happening outside. The water in her clay cistern remained liquid and cool. Her small garden was an impossible, miraculous patch of green in a world of white death. She was not fighting the storm. In her stone womb, she was simply outside its reach. She was safe, warm, and utterly alone. On the 4th day of the freeze, when the world outside was a landscape of frozen torment, a new sound broke through the howl of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on the crude wooden door she had fashioned for her entrance. Bran shot to his feet, a deep, warning bark erupting from his chest. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. No person could be out in this. It was impossible. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her hand steady, and moved toward the door, Bran growling at her side. She pulled back the heavy bar that locked it. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it inward. A figure, completely encased in ice and snow, stumbled and collapsed onto the stone floor. It was a boy, no older than 16, his face a mask of frozen tears and terror. He was half-conscious, his body shuddering violently. Elara slammed the door shut against the storm and barred it, then knelt beside him. She recognized him. It was Thomas, Mr. Gable's younger son. She and Bran dragged him closer to the fire, his frozen clothes cracking as they moved him. She worked quickly, her actions born of pure necessity. She cut away his stiff coat and boots, wrapping him in her own blankets. She forced spoonfuls of warm broth, saved from a boiled rabbit, between his blue lips. For a long time, he could only shiver and moan, his words lost in the chattering of his teeth. Finally, his eyes focused on her, wide with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "My sister," he gasped, his voice a raw whisper. "Anna, the fever came back. The house, it's so cold. The medicine is frozen. The doctor can't keep his own fire lit." He clutched her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "My father, he sent me. He said, 'Go to the Folly. It's the only chance.'" Elara stared at him, the irony a bitter taste in her mouth. The man who had cast her out, who had mocked her efforts and left her for dead, was now sending his son to her for salvation. She looked around her shelter, at the stacked firewood, the precious food stores, the irreplaceable warmth. Helping them would come at a cost to her own carefully managed resources. A part of her, a cold, hard knot of remembered pain, wanted to say no, to let them face the consequences of their own cruelty. But then she looked at the desperate boy, and she thought of the sick child in the freezing house. She thought of the baby growing inside her. It wasn't a choice, not really. Not for the woman she had become. She had not built this place to hoard life, but to sustain it. Her decision was made in an instant, expressed not in words, but in action. She stood up and went to her stack of bricks near the kiln. She chose a dozen of the best ones and placed them on the hearth, letting them soak up the intense heat of the fire. While they warmed, she filled a sack with potatoes and turnips from her garden, added a loaf of the dense, hearty bread she baked on a flat stone, and wrapped it all in cloth. When the bricks were almost too hot to touch, she wrapped each one in layers of spare sacking, creating small, portable furnaces. She loaded everything onto a small, crude sled she had built for hauling firewood. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with dazed, uncomprehending eyes. "Can you walk?" He nodded weakly. "Then we go, now." She pulled on her own warmest clothes, handed the rope of the sled to the boy, and with Bran leading the way into the blinding storm, she ventured out to rescue the family that had left her to die. The journey back to Providence was a descent into a frozen hell. The wind was a solid wall, the snow a blinding, stinging fog. But Elara and Bran knew the path. Bran, with his nose to the ground, could follow the ghost of a trail that was invisible to human eyes. Elara walked behind the sled, a steadying presence, ensuring the precious cargo of warmth did not fall. Thomas stumbled ahead, a figure of sheer, desperate will. When they finally saw the first frozen rooftops of the town, they looked like tombstones in a graveyard of ice. Mr. Gable met them at the door of his house, his face a haggard mask of fear and exhaustion. When he saw Elara standing there in the swirling snow, her face calm and determined, his expression crumbled. He simply stared, speechless. They brought the sled inside. The cold in the house was shocking, a damp, penetrating chill that was somehow worse than the clean cold outside. In a back room, his wife, huddled over their small daughter Anna, who was wrapped in every blanket they owned, but still shivering with fever. Ilara didn't wait for permission. She placed the hot, cloth-wrapped bricks around the sick child in her bed, creating a cocoon of deep, radiating warmth. She handed Mistress Gable the sack of food. The woman took it with trembling hands, her eyes wide with a stunned, painful gratitude. Mr. Gable watched it all, his face working with a storm of emotions: shame, disbelief, relief. He followed Ilara back into the main room of the store, the place where he had condemned her. He stood before her, a broken man. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the freeze. He looked at her strong, calloused hands, her clear eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture. He was seeing her for the first time. Then he looked past her, out the door, toward the storm that was killing his town, the same storm she had just walked through. "How?" he whispered, the word barely audible. "How are you alive?" Ilara met his gaze. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I built on stone," she said simply. "You built on pride." Later that day, after ensuring the child was stable and the family had a small measure of warmth from her bricks, Gable insisted on seeing for himself. He followed the tracks back to the folly. When Ilara opened the door and he stepped inside, the shock hit him like a physical blow. It was not the cold, damp cave of his imagination. He was met with a wall of steady, gentle warmth. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his own freezing home, struggled to adjust. He saw the neat stack of firewood, the soft glow of the fire in the stone hearth, the impossible sight of green plants growing in wooden beds. He heard the clucking of chickens. He saw the full cistern of clean water. He saw a home, a sanctuary, a fortress of life and order carved from the chaos that was destroying his world. He walked slowly around the space, his hand trailing along the warm stone of the back wall. He touched the leaves of a turnip plant as if it were a holy relic. He looked at the simple, ingenious systems, the chimney, the cistern, the coop. This wasn't madness. It was genius. A genius born of desperation and will. He saw the stack of perfect red bricks and understood that she hadn't just been surviving, she had been creating. He turned back to Ilara, who stood by the fire, watching him with her quiet, unnerving calm. The full weight of his foolishness, of his cruelty, crashed down upon him. "We called you a fool," he said, his voice thick with shame. "My God, we were the fools." He sank onto a wooden stool, his head in his hands. "We left you to die." Ilara's response was her greatest act of grace. She did not offer words of forgiveness or condemnation. She simply took a loaf of bread from a shelf, the one she had baked that morning, and handed it to him. "Your family is cold," she said. "Take this. There are more bricks warming. Take them too." In that simple, profound act of giving, she offered not absolution, but life. She demonstrated a strength of character that dwarfed the physical strength it had taken to build the cave. He had tried to break her spirit, and in return, she was offering to save his life. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his days. When the Great Freeze finally broke, the town of Providence thawed into a state of humbled grief. They had lost livestock, homes, and 3 souls to the cold. In the aftermath, a slow procession of townspeople made their way up the trail to Gable's Folly. They did not come to mock, they came to trade. They brought jerky, cloth, and tools, and they traded them for Ilara's hard, red bricks and the dense, life-giving bread she baked in a small oven she had built into her hearth. Her home was no longer called the Folly. The trappers and travelers who passed through began to call it the Hearth, for the impossible warmth it offered in the shadow of the cold stone ridge. Mr. Gable, a changed and quieted man, was the first to use the new name. He stepped down from his position on the town council and became one of Alara's most reliable trading partners, never again meeting her eyes without a flicker of profound shame and respect. The story of the cave woman who survived the freeze became a legend. But Alara was no legend. She was a force of nature. In the spring, her own child was born, a healthy, strong daughter she named Hope. With the help of a now grateful community, she expanded her shelter, using her own bricks to build a proper house front onto the cave entrance. The cave itself became a magnificent bakery, its geothermal warmth perfect for proving dough, its stone oven turning out the finest bread in the territory. People learned from her. New buildings in Providence began to incorporate stone foundations and clay insulation. They learned the value of thermal mass, of building with the land instead of just on it. The settlement changed, becoming tougher, wiser, more resilient, remade in the image of the woman it had once cast out. Years later, Alara would stand at the entrance of her home, her daughter playing nearby, the scent of baking bread mingling with the clean air of the high country. She was no longer the discarded widow, the object of pity and scorn. She was the heart of her community, a quiet matriarch whose strength was written in stone and baked into every loaf of bread. She had been given nothing but a rock and a mockery, and from them she had built a life, a legacy, and a future. Her story served as an enduring reminder that true worth is often hidden in the places others deem worthless, and that the strongest shelters are not built of wood or nails, but of an unbreakable will and a spirit that refuses to be defeated.